Chapter 5. The Language of the Self. Until you have returned to the awareness of who you really are, God, you have only one purpose in being here, and that is to make this discovery. After that, you're totally open, and the God you are overshadows its servants, the body-mind, in a pure union that shows you, in every moment, where to go, what to do, what to say, and who to say it to. It also shows you exactly what your purpose is and what you need to know in each moment to flow with it. This is when you stand in divine sovereign independence, or in an individuated God Self-One, yet radiating your unique light through a facet of the diamond that is pure conscious awareness. The Self is in constant communication with itself, you, as you drift in the dream of separation and limitation. And for the most part, you've been unaware of this except through flashes of insight, hunches, as well as signs and symbols that direct you to make choices that are in perfect alignment with remembering who you really are. Since most people do not hear or understand the voice of the Self, it tries to communicate with you through signs and symbols, dreams, and the mirror of experiences to point you within. For a long while you did not give any special meaning to these phenomenal messages, and chalk them up to chance or luck or coincidence, if something magical or miraculous happened when you followed that guidance. But as you approach the breaking point of your endurance in the false self's world of chaos and suffering, you begin to get the feeling that maybe something is going on that you should consciously pay attention to. Hunted like criminals. In the old energy, those who did pay attention were outcasts, and depending on which century you look at, reviled, condemned, tortured, and killed. Fear of the unknown was behind much of this ignorant behavior, but religion and its hierarchy often glimpsed the real origin of what seemed like supernatural abilities, and suspected that these people with seemingly special abilities would usurp their authority over their followers. Since women were the most receptive to listening within, they experienced more of these so-called special abilities than men, and were hunted down like criminals as witches, gypsies, and misfits, and burned or drowned or stoned to death. A few men understood what lay behind the illusion of the world as the false self lived it, but for the most part hid themselves away from the brutal judgment of inquisitions as alchemists or in secret sects, disguised as something less threatening. Or they would recant their findings and accept the stranglehold of the Church, such as Galileo did, who escaped death, but was held under house arrest for the last few years of his life. By the way, he did get an apology from the Church several hundred years later. Nevertheless, throughout the world, so-called holy people such as shamans, witch doctors, soothsayers, elders, and sages have existed down through history, usually not in plain sight. They had an affinity with Mother Earth and were in touch with the Self, offering what many looked on as supernatural guidance and remedies for the suffering that plagued humanity since it descended from God awareness into the separated body-mind experience. Once again, however, this was not an error. It was your choice, as the God you really are, to descend in ignorance of who you really are into the material world of separation and limitation, so that you could experience and play in the dream movie of life fully, to know the deepest darkness in order to know the highest light. The swing of the pendulum is equal on both sides of emptiness. A house of mirrors. While the Self can and does communicate directly with you through the telephone line of the intuition, the average person did not connect with this natural faculty until recently, and still with some degree of skepticism for most. No matter how well you may or may not be connected through your intuition, the Self communicates with your sleeping body-mind false self through what I call a house of mirrors. It reflects back to you everything that is blocking the truth of who you really are, and it has always done this, but now humanity is beginning to notice as a collective consciousness. Few as yet realize that everything that they are getting mirrored back to their consciousness is about themselves, but it's always about you. When you cross the threshold of this awareness, you pass from merely being an actor in the movie of life to being the witness of the movie as well. This is the moment when you are free, not of all the conditioning that has defined the false self, but of your identification with the conditioning. This is a huge difference. You stop the finger-pointing, judging, victimization, and blaming attitude of the false self, and recognize that everything you're experiencing is a reflection of who you are not, combined with some mirrors of who you really are. Transformation. As transformation of more and more of the identifications, attachments, and expectation outcome conditioning of the false self takes place, more and more mirrors show up revealing the beauty, abundance, love, joy, peace, and freedom that you really are. This is why the true self can live in the world, but not of the world. They can walk through the chaos and suffering of the world, never losing their peace and freedom. This may seem to make them heartless, but in reality it makes them far more compassionate, since their clear vision allows them to witness the suffering of the blind perfectly. They do not comfort the false self, or play into its hands with sympathy. They give it no attention at all, knowing that it, in truth, is not real. Instead, they see those that are suffering for who they really are, God. Jesus never saw sickness. He saw God in disguise. He saw the effects of ignorance, of conditioning, and he saw the truth in the one wearing the disguise of sickness. Had he not done this, he would have only been attempting to so-called heal in the traditional time-bound ways. Those who accepted his knowing of the truth were spontaneously restored to wholeness. It was their belief in his knowing that restored them. They shifted their conditioned beliefs that had created the illness disguise to the unconditioned truth through his knowing. Looking toward the new energy, he said, "You will do what I have done, and greater things will you do." He knew they were just the same as he was and is, God, but were unaware of this truth. How mirrors show up. I'd like to give you a few of the more obvious mirrors about how life has no choice but to mirror back to you who you believe you are, in every moment, because your entire life experience is literally a reflection of what you believe about yourself. This ties in with what I said earlier about how important your attention is. Until you're totally free, your conditioning is underpinned by self-judgment, which is a form of deep unworthiness and self-hatred. For many people, this is far too painful to even consider looking at, so it's buried in the deepest vaults of their unconsciousness. Buried or not, it's a belief about who they are, and is therefore being given unconscious attention, and attention results in experience. For those who have totally bought into the dream reality of the outside world, most of their experience is caused by this unconscious conditioning. They are literally prisoners to it, and this is why they'll often express themselves as if they're a victim. When you turn on the news and see protesters screaming profanities at this or that politician or manufacturer or financial institution or foreign government, you're witnessing self-hatred. This doesn't mean that what they're saying about these abuses is not happening. It means that they have chosen this way to express their hatred for themselves that they cannot yet look at within themselves. They may even choose to become activists, which I addressed before, and join organizations that eventually bring about what appears to be a positive change in whatever the protested situation was. Again, this simply shifts the deck chairs around in the Titanic. The underlying cause of the abuse has not been addressed within, only the outward circumstances, and the self-hatred has not been looked at and transformed. As a result, the underlying cause will find another and another and another outlet, as will the self-hatred. Again, if your joy is ignited in these kinds of activities, then there is a definite purpose for you being involved in that movement. Powerful mirrors. Bring this down to the family level and look at the arguments, obsessive-compulsive behavior, control, codependency, abuse, and violence, to name just a few common relationship experiences, and you're once again witnessing self-hatred directed outward to avoid looking within. Family relationships are one of the best and most powerful environments to drive the false self inward towards self-discovery, and the self uses them at every opportunity to do this. Relationships provide a wonderful and powerfully clear and ongoing mirror of the buried conditioning that exists within every false self, and offers numberless opportunities to see this toxic conditioning exposed. Sexual attraction often helps to keep the union together for a while, and as the couple wraps responsibilities and commitments around their relationship, the bond grows tighter and tighter, and hidden resentments tied to more identity, attachment, and expectation conditioning begin to show up through the relationship mirror. When you do begin to look inward for answers, conditioning naturally starts to rise to the surface, where it can no longer be ignored, and relationships show up that provide a clearer and clearer mirror with which to recognize what is ready to be transformed. When I jumped off the cliff into self-discovery January 5, 1999, I opened up Pandora's box, which according to Greek mythology means to release all the evils into the world. For this reason, the myth has appeared as a dark and forbidding choice, but from the standpoint of the self, it's the best choice anyone ever makes towards their freedom. Evil is just another way of describing conditioning, and the so-called devil is really just the false self. In order to control its followers, religion has fabricated all kinds of horrifying mental and physical images about the devil and its hellish domain. But even the tiniest bit of clarity shows you that these are actually conditions everyone who lives in the dream world of the false self experiences every day. As I said earlier, when I made the terror-filled and wonderful jump into self-discovery, it wasn't long before I was living with and married to a woman who for me represented Kali Ma, the ego false self slayer. Toxic relationships. When toxic relationships break up, you so often hear things like, "I finally got rid of that lying bastard," or "The bitch took me for everything, but I'm free now," or "He was a soul sucker. I hope he burns in hell." But the truth is that toxicity goes with you to find a new host until you finally look within to find it's you who chose the perfect partner to mirror your own conditioning. Why do you think there are so many widely popular movies out these days about vampires and zombies? They are huge glaring mirrors for how much of the youth of the world feel about themselves. Walking Deads. This is not a criticism at all, just the opposite. It's a recognition of how the new souls being born onto the planet, mostly during these last 3 powerfully transformative decades since the 1980s, are choosing to look straight into the mirror at what needs to be transformed. It doesn't matter that many of them don't realize what lies beneath the attraction to these kinds of entertainment. The effect of looking at your mirrors and feeling them eventually brings you into your freedom. Self-discovery turns everything the false self says about the world upside down and shakes out the nonsense. What looks dark and ugly and disgusting is what is being shaken out of the deepest depths of the false self's conditioning to look at, feel, embrace, and have transformed. The entire world, and the growing chaos we witness every day now, is Pandora's box, being shaken out. The Greek myth also says that what is left when it's empty is hope. The truth is, it's far more than merely hope. It's your freedom. My Kali Ma experience exposed me to the wretched life I'd been living. It mirrored the self-hatred I had masked with wealth and power and arrogance, and ripped the carpet out from beneath my every false sense of security and self-worth. My Kali Ma showed me I felt totally unworthy. But doesn't that seem to contradict where I had just spent the previous 15 years, in the lap of luxury, wealth, and influence? Many people in positions of power and influence and wealth live lives filled with a poverty consciousness. As I already touched on, in my case, my enormous need for recognition, based on feelings of being invisible and of no value, provided the passion to become recognized through wealth. And yet, despite my wealth, I would price shop. I would compare the price of a can of beans in a grocery store to another to save pennies. I would see an expensive suit I wanted and wait until it went on sale before I purchased it. I would be sure to shop where I got air miles and bargain shop whenever and wherever possible. I would select the special on a menu when what I really wanted was something totally different. And most of all, I would deny myself free time away from my business. I remember sitting in my home office in the middle of the summer, looking out my window at the beautiful weather and longing to be on a beach somewhere, or having lunch at some outdoor cafe in Paris, or cruising along some tropical paradise. But no, I was deathly afraid of what would happen to my business if I took my eyes and my control off of it for even a day. I owned nothing. It owned me. Burned out. Finally, after almost 10 years of looking into the mirror of self-hatred, I found myself walking down I-95 toward West Palm Beach Airport in the middle of a dark, moonless night with a shirt on my back, pants and shoes too, and $5 in my pocket, defeated, desperate, lonely, and ripped apart. In truth, the false self's armor had only been pierced, and there was still much to be transformed. But a major layer of conditioning was now raw and exposed, ready to be felt, embraced, and transformed. If I thought I had felt the fire of self-discovery before, I was to learn I had no idea what it really meant yet. I paint this portrait of my self-discovery to expose what my stubborn character chose to experience, the deepest darkness, so that I could one day experience the highest light. Today, choosing freedom and the direct route to it through self-discovery is infinitely simpler than what I'm sharing with you. The frequencies of light bathing the planet and humanity now are so high that what once took lifetimes to accomplish can be done in just this one lifetime alone that you're currently living. Unconditional love. Then there's the concept of unconditional love. The false self convinces itself exists in a relationship, the reason for being together, the reason for your very existence. However, as long as there is one single buried condition filtering the false self's idea of what love is, it is not unconditional love. And a quote from Byron Katie: "I will love you as long as you give me what I want, or you don't threaten what I have." The love you hear thrown around by the false self sounds like the title and words to so many songs that you hear. "I gotta have you, baby. I can't live without you. Life's no good now that you're gone." These words and concepts have nothing whatever to do with unconditional love. They have to do with the false self's neediness based on the lack of truth it is continually expressing. It feels empty, hollow, and lost, and desperately searches for someone and something to hold on to make it feel safe, secure, and loved. It has no idea at all that the truth about it is that it is love itself. As another song says, "I've been looking for love in all the wrong places." The concept of unconditional love you hear thrown around like confetti is not known, nor can it be known where conditions of any kind exist. Unconditional love is not conditioned. It is pure. It holds nothing to itself. It is completely free and extends freedom to everyone and everything. It is totally without judgment of any kind. It radiates peace and beauty with every breath, and it is never ending, since it lives in the now moment always. It is who you really are in truth, and while you believe you are less than the God you are, it is not possible to experience unconditional love. When you use the word relationship in any context, you are speaking of separation. I relate to you. There is a me, and there is a you. No matter how beautiful this relationship may be, there is still separation, and in separation there are conditions. Unconditional love is a seamless union, boundless, borderless, and timeless. It is freedom as oneness. Saying that you love unconditionally does not make it so. That emanates from the false self-conditioning. You can't make yourself love unconditionally. You are love, and true love is unconditional. It radiates this without words, without thought, without effort of any kind, when you know who you really are. There is a well-known sentimental Christmas story by O. Henry of a poor young couple that loved each other very much in the romantic way the false self sees as love. Before I tell you this, let me first be absolutely clear that romance and passion definitely have a place in our lives, and are wonderful expressions of the self savoring its creations. But it has been given top billing by the false self as a validation that someone loves or doesn't love, and this is not true. Unconditional love has no conditions, romance or no romance. It just is. You may have heard this story, which I will summarize for you. It's very cozy and touching, but there's an underbelly to it that I wish to highlight. The young couple adored each other very much, and both had prized possessions that the other wanted to make even more enjoyable for their partner. The young wife had the most beautiful long hair that hung well below her shoulders, and her husband owned a gold watch handed down to him by his beloved father and grandfather. Christmas was close, and the young husband wanted to buy his wife an exquisite hair set with brush and comb and hair barrette to hold her beautiful hair in place, and his young wife wanted to buy her husband a gold chain and fob for his watch. Christmas came, and despite the lack of money, the husband presented his wife with the beautiful hair set, and the young wife gave her husband the gold chain for his watch. The young wife had sold her hair to buy the gold chain, and the young husband had sold his watch to pay for the beautiful hair set. The irony is thick with sentiment, as well as the concept of loving sacrifice. But here's the wrinkle in this moving story, which, by the way, I love very much for many years, and it's called The Gift of the Magi. Unconditional love does not involve personal sacrifice in order to express itself. It involves sacrifice of the personal false self in order for who you really are to be revealed. The difference may appear subtle, but it's a huge difference, and a distinction that can only be made when one truly knows who they really are. The language of the self. Experience. Your true self uses every means at its disposal to gain your attention and communicate with you what is ready to be transformed. That is, what conditioning or blocks to the awareness of who you really are is ready to be transformed back into the nothingness from which it came. Every experience, no matter how insignificant it may seem, is speaking to you about who you are not, or revealing to you who you really are. This may seem incredible, but remember, until you have returned to the awareness of who you really are, God, you have only one purpose in being here, and that is to make this discovery. Let's say you're driving through town minding your own business with nothing in particular on your mind, and suddenly someone swerves in front of you, nearly causing an accident, and honks their horn repeatedly at you as they race away. What is likely to be most people's first reaction? What did I do? It's not my fault. What an asshole. Who the hell do they think they are? They could have killed both of us. In other words, to that effect, right? If you did react this way, it's perfectly normal. It's okay to express anger in the moment, but it's how you choose to look at this afterward that determines whether you're listening to the self speaking to you. Remember, everything is about you. So what might this incident mean at a deeper level? In an experience like this, you may even wish to pull over to the side of the road and open up to what you really feel, to what comes up. Perhaps you feel violated, unseen, and abused. Now you are starting to really listen. Let's say in this case that what triggers your feelings most is the feeling of being unseen. Feeling invisible is a major cause behind someone acting out to get attention, and this can manifest in many different ways. They may dress in a radical way. They may often speak loudly. They may be an overachiever at work, or they may be a caretaker of aging parents, shut-ins, or even work in a hospice. I'm not saying any of these activities are right or wrong. In truth, there is no right or wrong. I'm pointing at them neutrally as parts we play in the movie of life that may be speaking about your conditioning. In my case, feeling unseen was a very significant feeling that I had buried out of conscious sight when I was about 10 years of age. One day when I was just about to head out the front door of our house to go to a Cub Scout meeting, my dad came home slightly drunk. I don't remember what triggered it, but a few moments later he knocked me down to the floor and kicked me violently in the ribs, fortunately for me in his stocking feet. He screamed something at me, and my mother quickly got me to my feet and out the door so I could escape any further abuse. I remember limping down the road for about 2 houses, then slowly coming to a halt, bent over in great physical pain, but far more so in my heart, as I sobbed at a depth of sorrow I had never before felt. Something had snapped in me, a feeling like I was of no importance whatsoever, invisible, you could say, like being stepped on as an unseen insect that had just happened to be in the wrong place. Something slammed shut in me in those moments of deep sorrow, and a wall went up that later manifested as a kind of stoic, nothing can hurt me, nothing can touch me. I can and will bounce back from anything. This would take on many different shades of gray as it tainted my behavior throughout most of my life. I put up a mask of strength and was blank in the face of any kind of challenge or disaster. As an entrepreneur, I tried many different enterprises before I finally became wealthy, and each time a business fell apart, I would bounce back like nothing had happened to me at all, more determined than ever, with a steely grin on my face. To the average onlooker, I was invulnerable. This kind of behavior made me look almost like some sort of hero, brave, invincible, and courageous in the face of disaster, and of course, it got me a type of attention. The sympathy and admiration was almost powerful enough to justify me sabotaging my own efforts to succeed. This is how the false self creates dramatic scenarios in its experiences that spiral deeper and deeper into darkness and suffering, and yet suffering works in our favor to eventually drive our attention inward toward the guidance of the self. The body. The body is the most effective communication device the self has to gain our attention and get us to listen to what it's trying to tell us. It's virtually impossible to ignore its many ways of speaking to us, and if we are listening, it takes very little awareness to recognize the self's message. For most people, however, it takes repeated messages of greater and greater intensity before we listen. Certainly that was true in my case. If you get a paper cut in your finger, it does mean something beyond anything obvious. Now, if I heard this kind of information for the first time, I would think, crap, that's far too complicated for me. How am I supposed to know what every little hurt or wound means? That is where listening comes in. The intuition, what I like to call the telephone line to the self, will tell you exactly what it means every time. The self was just using this to get your attention. It will tell you what it means if you ask, and then listen. You may be inclined to say, well, that's just karma. I was supposed to have this or that happen. And you'd be right in the old energy. But the old energy is time-bound, where karma can exist. In the new energy, the now moment cannot contain karma because there's no past. Take a moment to let that sink in if you need to, because it has huge implications. The point is, the self has used what may in fact be a karmic moment to get your attention about a specific message. It adapts instantly to every opportunity to gain your attention. You may have been judging something in the news about what they did, which is a kind of victim finger-pointing. If you take this down the self-discovery road, you'll see how this, or any tiny incident, can reap major benefits in the transformation of the blocks to the awareness of who you really are. However, as I said about most people, in my case for certain, far more dramatic physical messages are usually required. Major life-threatening illnesses or accidents are very often the last straw for the self to get your attention. This same message about judgment that was ready to be transformed may have been coming to you for a very long time. In the old energy, that one block may have been a lifetime mission for the self to transform. In this lifetime, transformation of every block from every lifetime can occur, returning you to full awareness of who you really are, totally free of any blocks. That's how powerful this new energy is. On September 22, 1998, on the eve of the fall equinox, a symbol for death of the old, I nearly died. At about 3:30 a.m. on September 21st, I awoke in my country home alone, with a terrible pain in my lower abdomen. I had had food poisoning twice during my travels around the world, and it felt much the same, so I decided to ride it out, as I had done before. So in agony, I rolled over and somehow got back to sleep. Who would do that? Wouldn't most people get up and perhaps call a doctor? But no, not me. As I said earlier, I wore the mask of being the invincible guy that could handle anything. Or so I had convinced myself. When I woke up the next morning, the pain was much worse, but I continued to hang on for a few hours. But when the pain became intolerable, which was a major metaphor for where the false self had to be in my case before it was willing to consider going within, I decided I'd better call the hospital. I called emergency and told them what I was feeling, and they said it might be my appendix, and that they would send an ambulance right away. I gave them my address, which was on Norris Road, just outside town, but they heard me wrong and went to North Road, in town. 2 more hours went by as I lay on the floor drifting in and out of consciousness, but when I finally looked at my wristwatch, I realized something was wrong. No kidding. I somehow managed to get up and called the hospital again. This time they got the address right and sent the ambulance out again. I was on the floor writhing in agony near the front door when they arrived, and they got me onto the gurney and into the ambulance for the short trip to the little country hospital. By this time it was 12 hours after I first woke up to the pain. If you have ever had medical experience with an appendix, you know it's something that should be dealt with immediately. I got to the hospital and they contacted Toronto for my medical records, which took another 90 minutes. I was given a strong painkiller, so I wasn't in too much distress while I waited. That was the perfect time to start questioning what was going on. But while my condition was getting worse, everyone around me was acting like it was business as usual. Again, this was a reflection of how I had tried to handle chaos since childhood. So I just went with the oblivious atmosphere I was in and drifted in and out of la-la land on the painkillers. Then a nurse came and said they found something in my records that concerned them, and they didn't feel they could handle it in their modest facility. So off I went in the ambulance again, this time to an Ottawa hospital an hour away, where they took x-rays and checked my Toronto files, and the hours continued to pass. It was about 7 p.m. when a nurse came and told me that I would be operated on in the morning at 7 a.m., as the doctor who would perform the procedure was not available. Now, this was a major hospital in the capital of Canada, and there was no one available to perform an emergency appendectomy. Do you see what I had manifested as a result of handling any kind of crisis with my usual stoic mask? The nurse gave me more painkillers and a sleeping pill. By then, all hell had broken out in my abdomen, as I found out later. When I got this 12-hour delay information for an appendectomy, I should have known that there was definitely a very serious message the self was trying to give me, and that I should be paying attention to it. I had spent a decade looking at symbols, and knew they were messages to pay attention to, but now as I look back on this major turning point in my life, I feel the false self knew its time and control of my life was limited, and was using whatever it could to distract me. So I gave in to its subtle but powerful persuasion and took the sleeping pill, rather than taking this divine opportunity to look deeply at what I was being told. This may seem almost supernatural, that circumstances such as these are somehow manifested around the false self's conditioning, but this is how you so-called create your reality. In truth, as I explained earlier, all creation has already occurred, and you are choosing from an infinite menu what to experience. These choices, as in this case, are very often totally unconscious, since your conditioning has been so deeply buried within your subconscious, and layered with so many masks that it's like an airplane on autopilot for most of what you experience. The operation finally took place the next morning, 27.5 hours after I first experienced severe abdominal pain, and instead of a one-day stay in the hospital for what might have been a routine removal of an appendix if I had responded the first time I felt intense pain, I spent 8 days in intensive care, pumped full of antibiotics and morphine, on the verge of death. The experienced elderly doctor who performed the operation told me later it was a mess inside when he opened me up, and that I had a severe case of peritonitis. By the serious look in his face, I knew I was in trouble. That's when I finally began to go within and ask, what the hell is going on? I literally had to be at death's door before I opened up and asked for answers. I slept for most of my stay in the hospital, so whatever answers I may have gotten were blurred by the heavy-duty drugs dripping into my arm. Finally, I was released and returned to my country home with my wife and dad, who had come down to be with me during the crisis. My relationship with my dad for most of my life had been a very distant one, and I considered him to be a tyrant since I was a child. I didn't recognize at the time, but his deep concern and his being there for me was a clear mirror for the love I was beginning to show to myself. My dad represented the tyrant I had become, a subtle carbon copy of him masked in arrogance and radiating control in every area of my life. Despite my greatest efforts to be just the opposite of him, it was that very resistance that drew me into the thing I hated most about him. At the time, I knew nothing about embracing what you hate as the magic catalyst for grace to transform the conditioning blocks to the awareness of who you really are. But my little shop of horrors had another scene left to play. The resistance to surrendering fully into the arms of truth held an iron grip on me, and that night, while I lay on the couch in the living room so I wouldn't roll around, I had another brush with death. I noticed while drifting off to sleep on a cocktail of drugs the hospital had given me to get me through my recovery period, that I was not breathing normally. Unless we focus on our breath for some reason, breathing just sort of happens. In this case, it didn't just happen. I had to consciously breathe. After about 10 minutes of observing this, I realized that if I fell asleep in this condition, I would stop breathing and die. So, back to the little country hospital we rushed, and into another ambulance to the big hospital in Ottawa. A few hours later, as the sun was coming up, we were told I had been given the wrong prescriptions. They adjusted their mistake with a slightly nervous apology and sent me home again the next morning. The death of the old was sending me a clear and present warning to pay attention. If you're looking for the first time at the kind of signals that I'm describing, you may feel that I'm making up meanings to fit the circumstances. That, too, is a subtle trick of the false self to distract you away from the still and silent voice of the self. Everything, as I have said, is the self speaking to you about the blocks to the awareness of who you really are, or, as these blocks are transformed, a mirror for who you really are, as in the example I shared about my father's display of concern and the beginning of me loving myself. You do not begin to really live until you're awake and free, and until you're truly free, every moment of your life is oriented around this purpose, whether you're aware of this or not. Many people, especially those involved in spirituality, believe that to be awake is to be free, but this is not true. To be awake is to be aware of the possibility of freedom only. It's possible to live in this dream freedom for many years, even a lifetime, believing you have somehow arrived, and even preach that you are to other people. But unless you are living in the world, but not of the world, the odor of conditioning still clings to you, and everyone can somehow sense it. Over the next 90 days to the end of 1998, I waffled in and out of the extreme discomfort I was feeling around the death of my old life. I was a multimillionaire. I had all the trappings of life that most people struggled for, and a yearly income that was huge, and on the verge of getting much, much bigger, as the company I worked for was in a major expansion, and I was in the top echelon of global distributors. That's what the false self kept reminding me of as the urge to jump off the cliff into true freedom pulled at my heart. Sometime that fall, I attended a gala event in Orlando, Florida at a luxury hotel. It was a regular event I attended frequently over most of the 15 years since I joined the company, held at some opulent tropical resort around the world, and I usually enjoyed it very much. This time, however, I was there only in body, while the rest of me was drifting in and out of what-ifs. What would my future look like if I walked away from it all, I asked. I would get half of my sizable wealth and income. I had 3 books already published, and I had a few minor speaking events lined up at the Whole Life Expos, where most of the top names in the spiritual world spoke at the time. With the foundation of financial security I had, and decades of spiritual seeking I had done, I figured I would eventually have a best-selling book and be on the speaking circuit around the world in spirituality. I would be living the life of truth as I saw it then, and I believed that that would bring me the joy that had been missing in my life. And yet, something was bugging me that I couldn't put my finger on, and that held me back from making the jump right there and then at the gala weekend. The self knows exactly what is perfect for you in the moment, and if you're truly open, it orchestrates events for your highest purpose down to the smallest detail. Actually, that happens anyway, but the pain of resisting can be enormous. Part of my false self had died on the operating table in September. I knew that, and I felt it. And that was the final straw that pushed me over the edge towards real freedom. But the shock waves of that event were still slowly rippling into my heart, and I was not quite ready yet. And here's a quote by Mooji. The instant you genuinely say yes to truth inside your heart, a subtle vibration is felt. Don't overlook it. As you become open, it will guide you in subtle ways. Day by day, you become increasingly aware of its presence. On Christmas Eve, something snapped in me. Christmas had always been my favorite time of year, and I had a deep connection with Jesus. Not in the religious sense in any way, but in the sense of a man who had seen the truth and said no matter what to it. That day before Christmas was like a birthday for me, and I told my wife what I intended doing. Then, on January 5th, 1999, when I was supposed to be attending a leader's luxury holiday in Maui, Hawaii, I packed up my stuff and drove to my country home from Toronto for the last time. I had no idea the shitstorm that would follow. That thing that had been bugging me came and bit me in the ass a few months later. When I joined this company in 1983, I was $100,000 in debt from a previous enterprise I had started that went belly up. So we signed our distributorship application with the company in my wife's maiden name. The bulk of our income came to us through that name, and the distributorship and its huge net worth was legally in her name. Oops again. The self had organized my jump off the cliff through my body and powerful life-changing experience to first of all land me in the rocks below the cliff before entering the sea of self-discovery. Mangled and totally disoriented 2.5 years later, I received a tiny financial settlement, less than my legal bills added up to, and none of my distributorship income or its ownership value. I was like Wile E. Coyote after one of his famous attempts to catch the Roadrunner had gone wrong. The humbling experience was large enough to disassemble, but not totally yet eliminate my gigantic arrogance, one of my false self's most prevalent masks and a huge block to discovering my true self. It was a colossal gift of love from the self, but as you might guess, at the time a devastating experience that deepened a simmering depression that had been increasing for over a year, and placed a searchlight on me feeling completely unworthy of even living or having any purpose whatsoever of being here. You may be able to relate to those feelings in these powerful transformative times. Symbols. There are symbols everywhere. We're surrounded by them, and if we pay attention, they will speak to us what the self is trying to say in many ways. For me, it began with a fascination with numbers. In grade 10 high school, I was sitting in the first day of mathematics class with a new teacher who taught what was called in those days new math. He posed a mathematical question to the class and then asked for volunteers to offer their answer. I put up my hand and said, number 3. Several others followed with numbers that were different, but not number 3. The math teacher looked over at me like I had 3 heads, and many students began laughing. Then he asked, "What's your name?" And I answered, "John," feeling a little intimidated. "Are you absolutely sure your answer is number 3? He added. And I timidly replied, yes, but then quickly repeated my answer with a little more authority, yes, because in this case I was sure. He frowned at first as if he was checking for more heads. Then a huge smile came across his face, and he looked at the class and said, "Now there is a student who knows how to stick to his conviction, and he's the only one in the class that got the question right." There was dead silence in the class except for the pounding of my chest as I felt a swell of elation and pride, or what was really the feeling of self-worth. Needless to say, I really came to like that teacher, his class, and from then on mathematics. He was genuinely different from most teachers I'd ever encountered, in that he made me feel that perhaps I wasn't the rebellious screw-up my parents had always said I was. My self-esteem was beginning to grow, a good thing in the eyes of the false self, nevertheless a very important stepping stone toward recognizing who I really am. Self-esteem is valuing the false self, and it's an integral part of the self-improvement industry, which is a huge aspect of the fading old-energy patriarchal system. The false self is an illusion made up of, as I will continue to repeat, of acquired identities, attachments, and expectation outcomes, or conditioning. Again, an illusion cannot be improved or changed in any way except inside the dream it lives within. The self, on the other hand, is perfect and does not need to change, nor does it ever change. Self-esteem is not known in truth, the awareness of who you really are. Nevertheless, the symbol here, which was given to me by the self, although I was not aware of it, was about self-worth. I wasn't ready to recognize this at the level of the true self, who is always totally and absolutely worthy, but I was ready to recognize the concept of it. Again, self-improvement industry has been a huge help in drawing humanity away from the separated and limited feeling of being worthless or less than. It remains now for the awareness to be shifted to the true self as the false self dissolves through self-discovery and transformation. As I said, numbers introduced me to the world of symbols, and sometime later to the old energy science of numerology, which became a great fascination for me. Today, many of you reading this will have noticed the frequency that double and triple numbers seem to show up in your life through digital clocks, license plates, sports shirts, billboards, email timestamps, literally everywhere. 11 and 22 are perhaps the most familiar, but now 33, 44, 555, and 144 are also appearing frequently. I'll not go into the so-called meanings of these numbers, except to say that with a little research online, you'll find what feels right for you. It's important to understand that your self speaks to you in its own unique language, unlike anyone else, and it's always best to listen to it first. Certainly be open to what others are pointing to, but never accept anything as etched in stone truth unless it comes from your own self. It'll speak to you personally. Now, what do these number symbols mean to you? Every time you experience, that is, you notice them, the message is different, although it may feel like it has a similar tone to it based on your basic feelings about its meaning. For me, for years, I would see 1122, 1111, 1122, and 2222, and it has come to mean a kind of a cozy feeling of being on track. This would happen especially after seeing the same numbers in different places within a matter of minutes. Then, over time, it also became a warm feeling of not being alone. Remember I said that feeling invisible was part of the very foundation of my conditioning since childhood. So the sense that I was not alone was like a warm arm around my shoulder from an unseen source. Sometimes when I needed a little boost, whether I knew it or not, I would silently hear, "Do you believe this is a coincidence?" I knew that coincidences, luck, and chance were just fabrications of the false self, and that everything is orchestrated perfectly by the God you are. But somewhere tiny remnants of this belief must have remained, or I would not have received these words. Henry Wadsworth Longfellow said, "Though the mills of God grind slowly, yet they grind exceedingly small." This means that whatever remains of the false self's conditioning, everything is eventually ground down, transformed, back into the nothingness from which it came. You need do nothing. Just stay open and say yes to everything. Spiritual seeking can be a very lonely life, and it's not uncommon to feel completely isolated. The self recognizes this and sends many, many symbols to remind you that you are literally and always surrounded by love, what I choose to call light. In fact, you are light, both as the fundamental pure conscious awareness, or God, that you are, and in the wave particles that manifest the temporary world you experience. Symbols so often, therefore, are simply telling you that you are not alone, and all is well. Because this is such a very important knowing to be constantly aware of, I'll share what for me is one of the most powerful and profound experiences of my life. It became both a line in the sand experience, as well as a powerful lasting symbol of the truth that you are never alone. I was about 13 years old, and for some reason I was returning from downtown Toronto on the Red Rocket. That's what we used to call the streetcars when I was a teenager. I got on the Red Rocket and sat on a sideways seat that allowed me to see the sidewalk as it seemed to be sliding past the moving vehicle. That was more interesting on the long journey from downtown Toronto to the bus terminal loop in the West End where I would catch my bus connection home than it was looking at the back of someone's head in the normal front-to-back seating. Almost immediately my eyes were pulled slightly to the right toward a man seated in a front-to-back double seat and staring directly at me. He looked like what I could call sort of Mongolian, if you can imagine the kind of bony, muscular appearance, particularly in the face. Actually, at the time for me, he looked a little bit scary, like Lon Chaney Jr. in the Wolfman movies of that era. I attempted to ignore him, but his stare was like a tractor beam, which you might see in a science fiction space movie. You might get the idea that I love movies, and you'd be right. They're packed full of symbols and metaphors directed at truth, if you watch for them. Just think of the enormous influence "May the Force be with you" from Star Wars has had on countless millions of people for 40 years and longer. Then he did something that today would get him arrested. He patted the empty seat next to him in a gesture that was asking me to sit beside him. Well, even then, kids were taught not to speak with strangers, let alone go and sit beside one. But for some inexplicable reason, I did not hesitate for a second. I got up, went over to the seat, and sat beside him. He said nothing to me at all, but smiled broadly as if deeply satisfied, and I felt no fear whatsoever. Actually, I felt quite comfortable, what I would call today peace-filled. Then, as the Red Rocket chugged along, stopping frequently to let passengers off and on at every cross street, he gently placed his left hand on my right knee. There was nothing offensive or intrusive about the move, nor did I even reflex at this unasked-for movement. As I said, this fellow looked a little scary, and I should have removed his hand, jumped up, and shouted for help, but no. It actually felt almost normal, like a loving parent might have done. Finally, we arrived at the Jane and Bloor streetcar bus terminal loop, and everyone got off. As I was expecting my bus in a few moments, I went directly to the bus stop on the other side of a cafe situated in the middle of the terminal loop. The man, who I now recognized was very tall and muscular in appearance, followed me. He stood beside me and took my hand, actually very gently in his, but he still said nothing. Again, I allowed this as I would a loving parent. Actually, I would never have done that with my own parents, since I didn't really feel loved by my parents at all. Cared for in a way, but not loved. And here's a clue to why this experience was happening for me. My life felt loveless, and if loveless, then empty, and if empty, pointless. So my bus arrived, and the man released my hand and watched me enter the bus. I sat by a window seat directly beside where I had been standing with him, and that's when it happened. The scary-looking man with the muscular, bony face and body looked up at me and placed his hand on the window beside me. He stared into my eyes with a light of love that went straight to my heart and made me gasp. Even as I write these words, I can still see and feel that look. I had never before experienced anything remotely like that look or that feeling, nor did I again until my life shifted out of the shadow of separation and into truth, and I found myself staring into the most beautiful eyes I had ever seen since that magical encounter. This time it was my companion at the time, Ingrid, a clear mirror who had experienced self-realization years before and had stood beside me for over 5 years as what I refer to as Kali Ma times 10, and helped bring me out of the prison of the false self and into truth. That encounter with the scary-looking man was a preview of what unconditional love looked like and felt like. Who he was, an angel, a master, I really don't know to this day, but is for certain that it was a very clear message from the self that I was not alone, and that I was deeply loved. And it took me through many, many dark years that lay before me before I opened my heart completely to truth, to love, no matter what, and discovered who I am. Symbols come in a multitude of ways, including profound experiences like these. Your eye might catch a glint of sunshine on an object lying on the ground, and you pick up something with your name on it and a smiley face. A feather may drift in front of your face, and suddenly you get the feeling of the presence of angels. Or you could be deciding which way to turn while lost on your way back to a hotel in a strange city, and immediately you see a sign with a pointing finger in the direction you're supposed to go. A symbol could appear on someone's belt buckle that draws your attention, or the icon on a hubcap, or a bunch of balloons floating above a nearby forest. They are everywhere, and the self will nudge you, or in some cases even push you, to get its message across to you. And if one doesn't work, it'll send you hundreds more until you do get the message. Most messages are subtle, and the triggers to get your attention may at first seem like nothing. But if there is a persistent pull to look at something again, then it's likely the self is trying to reach you. For example, I like to walk, not jog or run for exercise, although walking is an exercise, but I don't do it for that reason. I do it because I just simply love the joy of walking, particularly when it's around some kind of nature. One day I was returning from such a walk, and an elderly woman walked up towards me and quickly passed me. She was dressed for exercise and had a very serious look on her face, like she was going to stay young and stay healthy as long as she possibly could, no matter what. It was not a joyful expression on her face at all. It was a no-nonsense look that said, "Clear a path or I'll run over you." I got the message right away, not from her, but from the self, as a kind of reminder that there's no physical cause for anything. I must have had a tiny conditioning remaining that still bought into that lie. It's never about what's out there. It's always about what's in here. No matter how you may focus your attention and living habits on taking care of your body, if there's an underlying conditioning that you need to look at, and the body is the last resort for the self to tell you, no matter how well you take care of your body, the message will still come through in a way that you can no longer ignore. The really big symbols like car accidents, life-threatening diseases, financial ruin, family breakups, etc., don't come into your life unless you've missed or ignored many, many other symbol experience messages. There are exceptions. A child may be born disabled, and many people will wonder why. As you travel through incarnations back towards self-discovery and freedom, you encounter what some call soul-family relationships. It's not uncommon for a soul to incarnate with the sole purpose of helping others to open their heart, and this kind of relationship provides just that opportunity. Rather than the why me victim feeling you might expect, what often occurs is a redirection of attention towards the love you feel when you experience who you really are, in some cases through what appears to be tragic circumstances, when the oneness of the God that you are sweeps through your being like a hurricane of indescribable grace. Animal totems. For those of you who have beloved pets, whether you know what animal totems are or not, to occasionally witness strange and even incredible behavior by your pet is not unusual. And it's likely that at some point you may have seen a connection between the way your pet was acting and the way that you were feeling, or in some way paralleled the experiences that were going on in your life at the time. The self uses animals, including birds, fish, and insects, all the time to get your attention about something it wants you to become aware of. Every animal, bird, fish, and insect has a meaning, and once again, I'll not go into those meanings since each person's message is unique and will show up different for them according to that message moment. You'll find plenty of descriptions for each animal totem online, but I encourage you to be open to the specific and changing meanings each one of these has in each moment. You'll be told if you ask and listen. I don't look for these messages. They just appear, and it's best always to just stay open. The self will speak to you in its own way when you're ready for a specific message about a block to the awareness of your true self, or as I said, a revealing of your true self that has been opened as more and more blocks are transformed. Just before I joined Ingrid in Norway for the most intense 6 years of self-discovery I had experienced to that point, she watched from the front window of her mountainside vantage point as 2 giant eagles played in the wind over the fjord below for several hours. She knew then beyond any doubt that we were meant to come together. Another time I was driving home in the winter snow just outside our little mountain village when a herd of deer suddenly appeared to my right and charged across the road to the field on the other side. My heart swelled as I instantly recognized a wave of gentle receptivity emerging from my feminine nature that had been suppressed most of my life. For me, any animal that comes from right to left is a feminine influence, since the right brain is considered feminine. The self knew this and sent a message according to that understanding. But for you, the right side may represent a masculine influence, since the right side of the body is considered masculine. Everything is tailored to your understanding. There's no right or wrong. This is why whatever beliefs you may have will eventually, inevitably, lead you home. The only difference is that self-discovery happens in the now moment, while most beliefs speak about freedom in the future, often the far distant future. The meaning of animal totems may not reveal themselves immediately, but if this kind of communication appeals to you, you will very quickly begin to hear and feel what they're saying almost right away when they appear. I see spiders everywhere, and while they do still sometimes give me the creeps, I'll never kill one if there is any way to escort them outside safely. For me, they suggest abundance, since they're connected to the number 8, which is associated with abundance and power. They have 8 legs, unlike most insects, which have 6. The specific reference to abundance in that moment will vary according to what is going on in my life, and I know that it's a trigger for me, so I always take a moment to listen within for what it's actually trying to tell me. Not long ago, before Ingrid and I went our separate ways to leave 16 years of cloistered lives, part of mine with my Kalima wife in Florida, and re-enter the world to share the message of the Golden Age that you are God, a beautiful Russian gray cat came into our lives for a few months. Ingrid named him Armani, to highlight the abundance that earmarks the transformation of the poverty consciousness that has prevailed throughout humanity during the patriarchy. Armani immediately developed the habit of sleeping on a table just beneath a beautiful statue of an angel we had, so we knew right away to pay close attention to him. We'd had him neutered almost immediately, but unlike many cats after this kind of surgery, he would disappear for an entire day and evening into the woods that surrounded our mountainside home. We knew this was a message of independence to pay attention to. When you discover who you really are, you no longer have a personal identity, nor do you carry attachments to people or things, and have no expectations of outcomes. You step into what's called divine sovereign independence, and Armani was there to verify what was occurring. When you are no longer time-bound, the future does not exist for you. Certainly there will be flashes and visions of what is to come, and you may even have flexible plans, but because the now moment is so fluid and unfixed, like the 3D world of time and space, things can change in an instant. Messages such as Armani's behavior are specific pointings to what lies immediately before you. For us, since it was a male cat, that was a clear signal for me to move on first. Dreams. Everyone dreams every night, and most dreams are forgotten, but a few are remembered, and if we are meant to remember them, this often occurs just before we wake up, even if it's in the middle of the night. On one extreme, dreams can be a simple release of pent-up energy that we've stored up during the day. On the other extreme, they can be full-blown prophecies of something to come. even of some world-shaking event like an earthquake or a tsunami. Many people know someone who had a dream of the death of a close friend or relative, only to discover that they had just passed away the evening of the dream, even at the very moment that they had the dream, if they woke up and noticed the time. There are also many message dreams sent by the self, and once again, it's common for you to wake up immediately after the dream in order for you to remember it. There are many dream interpretation books available, but I encourage you to ask within for the true meaning, as there's no general meaning that fits all. The dream is actually a trigger to get your attention, and the self is always available to speak with you about what it wants you to know, if you ask and listen. When you first begin to ask and listen, you may find it a little slow going before the messages come through and make sense. But since you have asked, the self will give you many, many other messages in a variety of ways to reinforce its message, and very soon it'll become a second language for you. The feeling this communication gives you is wonderful, and for those who are new to self-discovery, it becomes a very tangible verification that something indeed is happening for your highest good. Soon you'll come to know that everything that you experience is for your highest good, and is one with the freedom that you already are. And a quote by Jung: "There is no coming to consciousness without pain."